Welcome to a very special interview show of the Prode. I'm Ritwij, and tonight's discussion focuses on the Quad, its relevance in today's geopolitical landscape, and the challenges it faces and the way forward for the Indo-Pacific. At the most recent Quad Foreign Affairs meeting in New Delhi, the grouping announced new initiatives on maritime surveillance and domain awareness, along with cooperation frameworks on port infrastructure, critical minerals, and energy security. Since its formation, the Quad has been widely understood as a strategic alignment aimed at countering Beijing's growing influence in the Indo Pacific, though its military dimension remains limited and largely non kinetic in nature. How successful has Quad been in countering China's influence in the Indo Pacific and promoting a rules based maritime order, and what challenges lie ahead? Joining us today to discuss this is Professor Victor Cha, Senior Vice President for Asia and Korea Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. From 2004 to 2007, Professor Cha served on White House National Security Council under the Bush administration as Director for Asian Affairs with responsibility for Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Island nations. Professor Cha also served as US Deputy Head of Delegation at the Six Party Talks and received two outstanding service commendations during his tenure at the National Security Council. Professor, thank you so much, sir, for your time. It's a real honor having you here.
Thanks. It's good to be with you this evening.
So let's begin with the recent Quad Foreign Affairs meeting in New Delhi. What is your overall assessment of the outcomes, and how significant is the newly launched Indo-Pacific Maritime Surveillance Collaboration in particular is with respect to what Quad nations are trying to project in the Indo-Pacific?
So I would say it was a successful meeting for certain. There are a few things that the second Trump administration, has continued on from the previous administration. The trilateral relationship between the U.S., Japan, and Korea is one. The tariff regime against China is another. But then the third is the quadrilateral framework, which actually has its roots going all the way back to when I was in government in 2004, 5, 6, when the earthquake and the Indian Ocean tsunami led to a ad hoc grouping of countries that came together for the disaster response. And that included these very countries: the United States, Japan, India, and Australia. It operated as an informal group for the initial disaster response period before international agencies and UN agencies could get set up on the ground. And then after that, it disbanded. But the fact that it came together sparked ideas in the mind of future policymakers that this was an important grouping and that it should continue in some format. The Japanese in particular were very positive on the idea. So it has since become much more formalized, as you know well. And I think it's encouraging that the Trump administration has continued this. The agreements that were reached in the last meeting were all, I think, very good. They address key concerns that all four countries have with regard to maritime surveillance and with regard to critical mineral and supply chains. So it's clearly, the grouping is demonstrating it has an added value, showing that when the four can work together, they can make progress on issues that matter to all four. But of course, the subtext of the Quad has always been whether it is directed against other countries in the region. And I think, to the credit of the Quad members, they have tried to maintain a fairly careful balancing act between seeing this as a grouping that is providing common public goods among the four members, and even outside the four-member group, and not making it appear as though it is some sort of containment coalition against China. I think, certain members of the group in particular are adamant about that. And that's why we've not really seen a military dimension to the Quad, as we have seen in some of the other groupings that are forming in the region, for example, between the United States, Japan, and Australia, the United States, Japan, and the Philippines, and other types of groupings like this. So overall, I think the results were good. I think it's encouraging that the Trump administration, although it shuns most multilateral groupings, still sees this one as important.
Yeah. So beyond maritime surveillance, and you touched on a few points, the meeting also produced frameworks on port infrastructure, critical minerals, and energy security. So do these initiatives carry equal strategic weight, or they risk being overshadowed by the security agenda?
No, I think the members don't want it to be overshadowed by the security agenda. I think they're trying to take a very functional approach to these sorts of things. And these, again, are energy security, critical minerals, ports. These are all areas. We used to call these things phase zero operations. So basically, operations and practices that could have dual use applications, but are largely for their stated purpose, like port infrastructure, for example. Um, I think that the four members, in order for it to be effective and for them to feel like they can operate as a group on these particular issues without worrying about blowback from China or from others, do their best to try to keep this on a non-military, non-strategic track. But having said that, the subtlety, of course, is the more that these four democracies in the Indo-Pacific work together, the more that also provides a good basis for them to define sort of the rules and norms in the region, so that others, unstated by name, but others will also be incentivized to follow those same rules and norms.
Yeah. Coming to security angle once again, the Quad is frequently described as non-kinetic and deliberately non-military. So, at what point, if you ever, do you see the grouping developing a harder military dimension, and what would drive that shift if that's the case?
Um, it's a tough question to answer because I think in many ways it's context dependent. Um, if we see like really aggressive activity by China or Russia or Iran or North Korea in the region, then it's possible this could take on a more military dimension. Um, the but I don't. But I think the members, I think in particular India, is not interested in seeing that take place, and so that's a natural limitation. I mean, if there were anything that might come together aside from the Quad in a military framework, there have been some calls for actually creating a Pacific multilateral alliance involving the United States, Japan, Australia, and the Philippines. Um, People like Eli Ratner, who was the former Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Indo-Pacific in the Biden administration, has explicitly called for this as a grouping. Um, I think before the Quad became any sort of military alliance, there might be other configurations that might play that role. The U.S., Japan, and Korea, they're not a trilateral military alliance, but there is a lot being done on both legs of that relationship, U.S. Korea, U.S. Japan, in the military space, that effectively makes it some sort of trilateral alliance. And it's a very, as you know, it's a very defense-heavy relationship also. And now, much more focus on defense industrial cooperation, whether it's joint production of interceptors or supplies of munitions indirectly to Ukraine. These relations have a larger military dimension. So my guess is unless something dramatic happens in the region, the Quad members will want to try to keep this as it is, a grouping that's focused on important but not necessarily military issues. I mean, the fact that they're focusing on critical minerals is a security issue in the sense that we've now defined things like critical minerals and supply chains as a part of national security. So that element of it might grow, but I'm not sure the military element of it will grow.
Yeah, stepping back, how would you assess the Quad's overall record in upholding a rules-based maritime order since its revival in 2017?
Oh, I think I think it's played an important role. And we're talking about almost 10 years now. And it is, it's not been perfect, but it's done its best to try to set rules and norms in terms of surveillance, early warning, um, disaster, what do you call it? Early warning disaster, these sorts of things. I mean, I think it's certainly played an important role. And it clearly has had value added. I mean, I think that's why the Trump administration, which eschews most multilateral groupings, still continues with this one. It may not be happening at the summit level, but still the fact that it's happening at the Secretary of State level is quite important.
Yeah. So coming on this point, there are those who argue that the Quad lacks teeth, that no leader summit was even confirmed in New Delhi, and that Washington's commitment under current administration is very uncertain. So is the Quad at risk of losing strategic uh, relevance, or it's a deliberate strategy to just not make it at leaders level for now?
I actually don't know why it's not happening at the leaders level. There are certainly opportunities to do it, if not discrete as a discrete event on the sidelines of other multilaterals. So, like the U.S. is hosting the G20, that would be a good opportunity to do a quad summit meeting on the side. But the problem is there are many demands on the U.S. president, and there are many demands on the host of the G20. And the fact that the U.S. president is hosting the G20 makes it extremely difficult to arrange these sorts of things on the side. The the leader level meetings are important when you are in particular trying to launch the grouping or trying to set a new agenda. Um, and so in that sense, the Quad has long since been launched. It's been almost 10 years. And they have a pretty clear agenda of things, a busy agenda of things that they're pursuing. So the leader level meeting is nice to have, but it's not critical, I think. And again, one hopes there's an opportunity in the future where um, Trump can be convinced to do it. As you know, in the past, it's also been done virtually among the leaders. There's virtual summits, and that I think is always an option. Obviously, the in-person option is always the best. Um, so I don't. Um, think that we should assume that there will no longer be a leader level quad meeting. I think it's still very possible.
Yeah, coming to the broader strategic calculations unfold in the Indo-Pacific, how do you assess the role of China's growing influence, and how is West, along with its partner in East Asia, looking to confront such a challenge?
Well, I think in the broader scheme of things, China is clearly the rising challenger in the region. Um, I do not believe that they are interested in seeing the United States as an Indo-Pacific power. So I do not believe they are interested in seeing the U.S. and China coexisting in the Indo-Pacific. The way they think about things, they think about it in terms of spheres of influence. And so China's sphere of influence is in the Indo-Pacific and perhaps beyond the First Island chain, whereas the United States has its own sphere of influence. But that really doesn't, at least in my mind, work for the United States because we are a Pacific Rim country. We are an Indo-Pacific power, and our alliances in Asia are extremely important. And Indo-Pacific countries don't want the United States to leave. None of them want, even countries that are not allies like Malaysia and Indonesia. They don't want the United States to leave because they don't want to be completely at the mercy of China. So the notion that the United States would ever leave as an Indo-Pacific power, I don't think is a part of a U.S. strategy, whether under Trump or anybody else. And this naturally causes tension with a Chinese view that this region belongs to them. The more, the more focused issue, of course, is Taiwan. And here, the recent Trump-Xi summit raised a lot of questions about what the United States is actually saying about Taiwan, whether it's actually changing their policy based on what the president said about rethinking the arms shipments to Taiwan. So we don't really know exactly. It's hard to guess what the president's actually thinking. I personally don't think there's a change in policy. But this is one of the areas where a Chinese vision of the Indo-Pacific and a U.S. vision directly clash, I think.
Yeah.
When it comes to this administration themselves and the president himself, again, there are a lot of questions because while on paper there is a geostrategic competition between the United States and China in the Indo-Pacific, between the resident power and the rising power, Trump's view is unclear. It's not clear to me how much he buys into the geostrategic competition argument, or how much he's really just focused on trade issues with China, where he really feels like he needs to rebalance trade with China. And so most people who are alliance managers and alliance watchers look very carefully at what the president says and whether what he is saying confirms the notion that he really does see a geostrategic competition with China, or whether all he really cares about is rebalancing trade with China.
Yep. You touched on the Taiwan issue. Now coming to another issue that has been debate around strategic circles. So especially on Asian NATO. So and a lot of East Asian countries, especially Japan, believes that there should be a concept around Asian NATO. So how do you feel about this subject, and do you feel an Asian NATO is important to counter China's influence in the region?
Um, I don't. So the notion of an Asian NATO, first of all, it would be very different from Europe's NATO, right? First of all, Europe's NATO it's a single contiguous piece of land with a clear dividing line, right on it, Poland, like Finland, a clear dividing line between the East and the West. The Indo-Pacific is both a land and a maritime theater. There is no clear dividing line, if you will. And so it's just much more complicated. The United States has built a system of hub and spokes alliances from the end of World War II in the region. And that has served each of those allies very well. But what we've seen recently is a sort of plurilateralizing of that hub and spoke system. So in other words, the US has a bilateral alliance with Japan, it has a bilateral alliance with the Philippines, it has a bilateral alliance with Korea. But what we're seeing is US, Japan, Philippines, trilateral, US, Japan, Korea, trilateral. AUKUS, US, UK, Australia. We're seeing these groupings emerging on top of the hub and spokes imprint that was created, nearly half a century ago. Now, should that be turned into a single collective defense organization? I think it's very hard to do unless the thing about these, when you create something like that, is you have to designate a clear enemy. Like NATO was created because of the Soviet threat, right? And so the question is, are all of these countries in the region really ready to say they were going to be part of a collective defense organization, the primary target of which is China? I think it's very hard for countries to commit to that. There may be policymakers in these countries that want to commit to that, but it'll be very hard, I think, broadly for countries to commit to that, because if for no other reason, when NATO was created, NATO countries did not have any relationship with the Soviet Union or with the Eastern Bloc. There was no commerce, there was nothing going on. this would be very different. It would be a collective defense organization targeted on China, while at the same time, for all of these countries, China's their biggest trading partner. So I think they would be very conflicted about it. Again, there may be some who say that we should do it, but to get a consensus to create something that explicit, I think will be very complicated and difficult. On the other hand, continuing to multilateralize, like continuing to see like missile defense integration between the United States, Japan, and Korea, military exercising at sea and air with the US, Japan, and the Philippines, seeing those sorts of things continue, I think that's entirely plausible and is recommended.
Yeah, I would like to conclude the discussion by asking that looking ahead, what does a successful Quad look like in 5 to 10 years, and what are the most critical steps the four nations need to take to get there?
It's a hard question to answer because it assumes that the Quad should be evolving into something else, and I don't think it should be. Again, my view of the Quad is from my personal experience when it started, which was that it was a functionally based coalition that came together to deal with a particular problem and to pool the resources of the countries to deal with that problem. And at the time, it was very informal. It has become more formalized now, but the mandate is still the same. There are a set of issues, problems that the four countries realized they would do better working on together than separately. And these change over time, but in the most recent iteration, they've been defined as you described them: critical minerals, port infrastructure, and the other things. And so I think as long as the Quad continues to do that and continues to follow through on the issues that they've decided to coordinate policy on and devote resources to, and then also put new issues onto their agenda that provide solutions for the four, but also public goods for the other countries in the region. It could be on things related to AI, or could be on things related to climate. I think then the Quad will be doing its job. It will be fulfilling its role. And then, of course, yeah, it would be nice, as we discussed, it would be nice for the leaders to be meeting all the time and meeting at least once a year to first give identity to the organization, demonstrate the highest level political commitment, and if necessary, lay out new agendas.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Chow, for your time and for your valuable insights. Once again, really appreciate you being here.
Thank you.